We will start on meeting order at 7 p.m. I'll start with roll call. Drew Falk.
James Whitesides.
Colin Forsyth. Kenny Renner Singer.
Allison Miller.
All right. Review of last month's minutes. So anyone have any comments on the minutes that Lilith shared with us? Sounding no, I will support a motion to approve said minutes.
I move to approve the planning commission meeting minutes from April 3rd, 2024.
Second,
Seconded.
Mr. Whitesides. Excellent. All right, so we can move into the main topic of the evening. Lilith, if you want to kick us off on housing ownership options.
Thank you very much, Drew. Planning Commission members. Don't see that we have a ton of public there tonight, but I have drafted a handout to kind of guide the overview discussion of RCW 6490. I don't want to go through 6490 in detail because, well, one, there's not a need, and two, it is extremely dull and dry. But there are questions related to housing and the option to use condominiums in the residential zones that can be answered in that code section. So what I did, the state law section. So what I did was I used the state law, reviewed it to answer these questions. These questions and answers have also been reviewed by our city attorney and modified or expanded where necessary. So I did get a request from the Residential Coalition, Chelan County, Kerbal, Skinnerland, to have an additional meeting in addition to the Planning Commission meetings to review this exact topic. So that meeting has been scheduled for 4 p.m. on the 22nd of May. It'll be a Zoom only meeting. I've scheduled it for 45 minutes, and it'll basically go through this same handout, plus be an opportunity for anybody in attendance to ask more questions. And then the goal will be to look at the actual code amendment with the staff report at a public hearing for the Planning Commission next month in June. So I believe that is June 4th or 5th. So we'll get that all advertised and out there as well. Unless I hear otherwise from the Planning Commission tonight that there's more concerns, but the idea is just to alleviate concerns. And I also wanted to point out that the changes in state law recently that allow for an additional accessory dwelling unit in addition to the one that we already allow. So the state law will require us to allow 2 accessory dwelling units per lot. That same state law also says that we cannot block or prohibit the sale of those accessory dwelling units independent of a residential unit. In other words, this very same state condominiumization regulation could take place. So what we're doing now is we're adopting it ahead of the allowance for the additional ADU, but from my perspective, it is something that's required under state law. And by adopting it now, we're just ahead of the curve, which is not a bad place to be. And furthermore, the way we're gonna propose to adopt it is that when somebody does do a condominium in the residential zone, it'll be treated the same as the commercial and industrial zones are now, in that it has to go through a city binding site plan process. Many jurisdictions across the state do not require that. The condominiumization process is only done through the state. Cities and local jurisdictions are not even required to be notified. But Leavenworth, several decades ago, had a condominium where the parking was modified and other things were of concern through the condominiumization process. And that's when they started requiring the binding site plan. We do the binding site plan very quickly. It just requires a review of what's being proposed and recording. I think the last one took less than 6 weeks. Does that sound about right, Maggie?
Yeah, I mean, it has to go through the public noticing process, just like, any subdivision would, but it's, it's pretty quick review. Yeah, the structures are already there. Just make sure everything complies with the state law.
Yeah, and then it's consistent with our approved plans. So way back when we started requiring the binding site plan, there was some inconsistency with the approved plans, construction and site plans. So we do check that as well. So having given that general overview statement, are there any questions of me before I run through this document?
Yeah, I just one quick clarification question. So the need to add the second meeting versus having that discussion today, is that just out of an abundance of caution with the amount of feedback you've received, or what's the reasoning behind it?
No, it's just quite simply a request from, a few members of the community, and it may be the region at large, not even the city residents. But I've found that it's easier to have that additional meeting now than to continue to persist with questions that might bog down the city council later on. And that may or may not happen regardless of the additional meeting, but I opted to add it to the calendar just to help ensure that we can get through this process more smoothly. And so to that end, I'm not sure how many planning commissioners can be there, but it will be recorded and I will give a summary of it. So I know that 1 or 2 of you will be there, and it's a meeting, it's not a hearing, so we won't require a quorum. And it'll provide an opportunity for the public, earlier in the day, which may be a benefit to them.
What's the date on that, Lilith, again?
22nd. I think it's already posted out in the hallway, so you can see it on the posting board out just outside the chamber there.
Lilith, before we jump into the questions, I think there is just one item on the RCW 6490 that we'd like to dig into, if you don't mind.
Yeah, let me pull it up. I have it right in front of me. What section are you thinking of?
025.
Where? 25, applicability of local ordinances, regulations, and building codes.
Yeah, Drew and I both saw this and as I read it, it says we cannot prohibit the condominium or cooperative form of ownership on a physically identical, summarizing it, on any physically identical development under a different form of ownership. So our regulation cannot prohibit it, but is that I think we really need to clarify that point.
No, that's right. That's exactly what I was saying, that this will apply in the city. And we want it to apply as a binding site plan. So what it says. were you looking at number 3 or what were you looking at?
I think number 2, so
6490.025.
Point 2, a zoning subdivision or other land use statute, ordinance or regulation may not prohibit the condominium or cooperative form of ownership or impose any requirement upon the condominium or miscellaneous community that it would not impose upon a physically identical development. Yes, that is exactly what I'm saying. And what we are just doing is we're reviewing the condominium process through the binding site plan. We're not going to require them to do anything more or less than an identical development would. We're just ensuring that things such as parking is the example that happened all those years ago. Excuse me, that generated the concern and required the binding site plan. So, yeah.
Reading into this, Lilith, though, I mean, wouldn't it say that we cannot prohibit condominiumization of properties? If we are zoned like in R10 zoning, it would say, we can't say you can't build a condo here. We cannot prohibit that ownership type. It would just have to meet the physical constraints of the law. I mean, it's relatively explicit in my reading, but I would love to have our lawyers tell us explicitly what that line means. Because adopting this sounds like we can't prohibit condos anymore.
So then
We
why?
can't, yeah, we can't prohibit condos. That's what I'm saying too. We can't prohibit them. But we can require them to go through a binding site plan, which allows us to review them, make sure they're consistent with what's required for that development.
So, I mean, Kerbals asks to have a separate meeting sounds, yes, I mean, if it's explained, that sounds okay, but to me, in my mind, that might be an unnecessary step based on the way the state code is written with a 2028 deadline or to pull this in, correct?
Well, it never hurts to talk to people. And that, yeah, so that's what I'm doing. Yeah.
It votes the question, I mean, does that particular change in our code need to be much more than we are adopting state 6490? And our only difference is we do require a comprehensive plan?
Yeah, what Pete's attorney has put together is very simple. And it basically is just acknowledging that we can do this process. So yeah, it's not a huge amendment. We're not adopting a new chapter. We're just tweaking a few sections.
Do this process, but we can't do it. So sorry, I'm just trying to clarify, given what the law you just read, we're going through a process, having people do this, and in no way can the city stop them from making a condo.
The city can stop them making a condo if they don't meet all the overlay requirements.
It's physical requirements, but in the case of, for example, the property on Sea Hill or on Stafford, that met the physical constraints of code.
Right.
Pete,
Hold on, we got a question.
Does that change, being mandatory like that, does that change any of the health and safety and fire codes that I was talking about at the last meeting? Would it waive any of those? Those would still apply, I would hope.
Zoning and subdivision are the key words in that state in point 2. So
yeah, I'm sorry, one talks about the building.
one is the building.
Yeah, one just is all fire code, but it's still applies.
That's a big concern for me.
It's just the ownership piece. Thing is essentially mandated.
Right, so this law is saying that as long as you meet all the conditions that are stipulated under all of our zoning laws, then you can. But why would we ever restrict somebody?
We won't be restricting people. We're just putting it in our code to process it.
No, I understand, but people seem to have some heartburn around this clause that says that we can't stop anybody from going through this process, but why would we want to? I don't understand why the city's interest would be served by stopping condoization in some circumstances.
Well,
No,
and- so
The problem is that right now it's not allowed, and that's just, is it explicitly stated in the Leavenworth Code, aside from being in the district use chart, as not a permitted use in RL 6 and R8?
yes.
So just the district use chart needs to change.
Well, I
Then
think,
will be, because it says in the district use chart with binding site plan,
mhm.
and then. and then
I
we
like,
would-
I like what Pete's attorney put together too about acknowledging setbacks and things like that. I have run the amendments by our attorney, and they didn't have any heartburn with the amendments as proposed. We'll be walking through it one more time with them when I put it in this, in the actual code language format and staff report.
I guess my question is, right now, are there references to where condos are allowed elsewhere in the code, or is it exclusively, like, there's a section about condos with binding site plans, but is there any other reference other than the district use chart as to where that use is allowed?
Where condos are allowed. I don't know if I've looked at it that closely. I know it's in the district use chart. Have to review the binding site plan to know for sure. But the reason why we've gone so slow on this process, or relatively slow, 3 meetings instead of 2, is to, well, 4 with the extra meeting, excuse me, but is to try and review the questions that the general public has had, clarify some items. So that's why I've come up with this list of questions and responses.
Okay, I mean, we can go through those now, I guess. Lila, do you wanna walk us through those?
Sounds great. Thank you so much. And, I really appreciate that the Planning Commission understands the clarity of what we're doing here. And I'm hopeful that if you have questions out in the public that aren't addressed in this sheet that I've put together, you could share those questions with me so that we could try to address them ahead of the city council hearing on this topic, which I would anticipate. The city council does have the option of adopting directly based off of this planning commission recommendation at their next meeting. So in June, when we have our hearing, if the city council is in agreement and doesn't want to take all the time and related issues for their own separate hearing, they could make a motion and adopt it outright. But the best way to help them feel comfortable with that decision is to walk through these questions, not have a whole lot of public questions if possible, and then to have a very clear and concise staff report and recommendation document. So we'll see how it moves forward. Quite simply, I started this document off by saying, does converting dwellings into condominium change the look, density, or function of a building? It does not. The property being converted is reviewed by the city to ensure it was legally constructed. Any structure constructed with a building permit has been reviewed for the parking and the height or other code requirements in place at the time of construction. And so long as it addresses those items, it won't change the look, density, or function of the building. If the development is expanded later on, state law does allow for that, and it does have provisions for how expansion of existing buildings takes place. Furthermore, if there is a request to further subdivide or to create an additional units, there are state regulations that talk about that. And of course, they'd still have to meet city building regulations. So for example, if there was a third accessory or building added to the property, a second accessory dwelling, and they wanted to include that in the condominium, that would go through all the city permitting process and an amendment to their condominium process as well. How are condominiums managed? Were there any questions on that first part?
I think so, no.
I think you'll get challenged on the "it does not" statement, but
On challenge on what part?
by stating that it does not fundamentally change the look, density, or function of the building. People will challenge you on that, so I don't know if you want to recraft that statement. Yeah.
But it is factually accurate.
Factually accurate, yep. Just thinking if we're going for a sensitive audience, or if we're attempting to be sensitive in the language, that we might soften that. That's all, that's my only suggestion. It's factually accurate, I agree.
I greatly appreciate your thoughts on that, and would really welcome any proposed text. My writings and communication style is not always soft and fluffy. I tend to cut to the chase, and you're right, sometimes that can be perceived more as a challenge statement. So yes, I'm very, very open to having feedback on verbiage and tweaking of words. I think AI might become a good friend as we move along, but I've been reluctant to try it. How are condominiums managed? There was some initial questions and concerns about the management of this property once it's converted. They are created by making by a declarant. That's the person who's creating the separate units, the owner of the property. And they create and record a declaration. So those are the state terms used. The declaration outlines how the owners association will function. The state law provides a very detailed outline of those roles and responsibilities and how their board functions. The owners association would include all unit owners, but the board would be a smaller makeup and additionally, maybe not this question. Oh no, it says it here. Additionally, the board may contract out with other persons or a managing agent to manage the property. Matter of fact, as I was reading these and knowing what's happening statewide, it seems like a brand new business opportunity for somebody who's interested, because, you know, even if Leavenworth were to have 4 or 5 or 6 of these in town, and we may end up with a lot more, or maybe not that many, but if we were to have just a handful of them, it would be a very interesting business to manage and function those properties on behalf of the homeowners association. And so that is allowed under state law. Is there any questions on how condos are managed?
No questions.
Okay, yes. How are condos maintained? How can neighbors be sure that the property will be maintained was one of the specific questions that had been asked before. quite frankly, it's the homeowners association's responsibility to maintain all the common areas. They do have, under state law, the ability to do emergency work, which may include entering a owner's unit and taking action. Depending on how they're set up and how they define their units, the unit owner or the association would be responsible for all exterior elements of the unit. One of the things I was thinking as I was reading through this material and thinking of these questions is on our binding site plan, that might be something we request. You know, what is the contact information of the homeowners association be provided to the city? By when they do the binding site plan, they haven't sold the units yet, and the board and the association haven't been necessarily established in any way, meaningful way. So that would be provided to us later, but it's something we can request. But in any case, I thought it was interesting that the homeowners association is also limited in things that they cannot impose on their units. So I added some information about that. They have to allow flags and political signs, and they have to allow solar panels under certain conditions. Are there any questions on how they're maintained?
Nope.
Why require a binding site plan? I think we've been through this one quite a few times. We just want to make sure that they have final building permits and that what they're proposing is accurate to the approved plan set. We've talked internally about utility services. If they're going to have private water metering systems, or if they're going to have shared metering system or independent metering systems is one of our utility questions. And if there's need for additional easements. So we'll look through those items as we review the binding site plan. The next question is, what happens if it is a 2-unit condominium? I
Well,
think so.
I want to go back to the binding site plan really quick.
Sure.
This is a little bit off topic, but I think it ties in and I think it needs to be clarified. But on Leavenworth Code 1836.035, it talks about accessory dwelling units. And point G on that says accessory dwelling units must be connected to the water and sewer utilities of the city. Now, a lot of these condos and or unit subdivisions, unit lot subdivisions would probably be more realistic in the UGA. And so wonder if we need to clarify this point.
Well, that's a larger question, and we won't be regulating what goes on in the UGA. The county currently does not require any process for a condominium, and I don't believe that they would be willing to adopt our binding site plan requirement. So that's a separate issue. So at the moment, we are thinking of this code strictly for the city limits. Subdivisions and binding site plans are considered procedural, and per our memorandum of understanding, they do not have to adopt procedural elements. They have adopted our subdivision code in the past, but I think that was quite a number of years ago and prior to this discussion of them being more procedural, on top of which the county does not currently regulate condominiumization in any way, shape, or form that I'm aware of. Was that helpful?
Not really. And so all the other code, right, is city code that the county enforces, but then they carve out a few things that they don't enforce.
That's correct. They get, in the past, they have chosen what they're gonna adopt or not adopt. With our latest legal challenge, they were told they need to adopt everything we send them. However, binding site plans are procedural, so is the condominiumization. So I have not talked to them about their willingness to adopt this, and I have talked to them about their desire to amend that section of code in the zoning code. And we're looking at options to do that. So it doesn't say directly in the city services.
Drew, right now, I mean, Drew, you brought this up because you're aware that like that line of code that says all ADUs must be connected to city services is like, has created a moratorium on ADUs being built in the UGA at all. So it's kind of a whole separate, like Lilith was saying, like they're not even allowing ADUs to be built at all. But if they did allow ADUs, they wouldn't stop you from condominiumizing it. But they have to, yeah.
Okay. Thanks for the clarification.
What happens if there is a 2-unit condominium? The declaration would outline how the condominium would be managed. This smaller number of units just means there's less to manage, but it also means there's more challenge. It may be more challenging to manage. And that is again why I think the state law provision that the homeowners can be managed by a separate agent may be a benefit for the smaller units if they need it, or should there be disagreement between the parties. But here, the city is not in the business of managing disagreements between property owners, whether that be in condos or separate lots. So that would be something they'd work out. And I think that was the concern when this question came up. But we can't draft code to avoid personal conflict. But the state law does have a good outline for how they're supposed to be managed. And I think as long as they follow that, they'll be in good opportunity to address any issues. I believe this is the second to last question. How are enforcement issues addressed? Enforcement is the same, whether it's a single family home or a condominium. It goes to the property owner. So if the violation is on the outside of the unit, most often would go to the homeowners association. If it's something on the inside of the unit, like a short-term rental, that would go to the owner of that particular unit. I think for the purposes of clarity, it is helpful in these types of situations to provide notice to both parties. I try to do that currently when we have, say, a leasee in a commercial building. I try to notify the building owner and the leasee of violations. But the requirement is that the owner is responsible to correct that issue. And then the last question, what if the owners association does not have enough money or funds? There is an outline in the state law that provides for the association making assessments. If there was a large bill that came up, a broken water line or something like that, they can make an assessment on the properties and they can collect the money. They also have in state law how they are to reserve their funds, spend their money. If they need to lien a property, there is a procedure for that, as well as appeals and dispute resolution. So, in the end, it's no different than any other homeowners association in a subdivision. So my hope is that these questions and answers address the bulk of the questions that people have related to condominiums and may, alleviate some of the concerns. And we can move forward with this without much controversy. So I'd love your feedback as planning commission members. I appreciate your comment on the first one. We'll work on softening that language.
Well, I think there's one question missing for me, and that's what would change. And so looking at the use table, right now, the only thing we restrict condos on are RL6 and R8. Everything else is covered as permitted. So in 1825-30, in the district use chart, we only excluded on the two smallest lot sizes now. So that, I think defining that for people, saying like what would change. That's
Oh,
really
in the code.
in the code, in our code, and in terms of where people could condoize in town. If that's essentially the differentiator, right, from today going forward. Or say when we accept the new code.
Well, in 17 in the subdivision code, we'll have to reference the 6490. So, yeah, well,
Change to follow the WCIOA instead of the Condo Act. But those are definitions based on state code, right?
yeah, so we're just bringing that state code in to the subdivision. Are we saying the same thing?
Sort of, I'm just saying that for people, when they ask the question, what will change, I think that question is missing in this document.
Okay,
This, all of the things that will happen in converting residential dwellings to condos, but people, to contextualize it, I think it's missing that, what is the actual change, so, correct me if I'm wrong, that's an R8 lot that you built on? Is R6?
6.
RL6.
No, 3,
3 are,
they're 3,000 square foot lots.
But the zoning is RL6.
the zoning's RL6.
Oh.
Yeah, I agree that it might be useful to highlight that we're not changing any standards in the code. And that the rules for condos have to follow all the rules of the zoning district, and it's just allowing something in more zoning districts than it currently is, but it's something that already exists and it already follows all the rules of the district,
Okay. All right, I'm just drafting a little note here on that. Okay. Any other comments, thoughts, questions?
Yeah, on the question around the binding site plan, I would say, thinking about our audience here, take credit for the fact that this is an addition to the state law. This is something that the city is doing. That's in addition to an extra step that might put some people at ease if there's a little more thought behind just rubber stamping state law.
Okay. That's a great point.
Any other questions, thoughts around FAQ for condos? Anything from the crowd? Yes,
What's the height on a condo in, I guess, anywhere in Leavenworth, is that, since that's what's gonna happen? What's the height?
it would match the existing height restrictions in the zone.
35 feet?
So it's 30 in the residential, and in the commercial, it's like 50.
Okay, so it stays 30,
It's
And multifamily is 35.
multifamily is 35.
Yeah,
So that,
it's,
I mean, we'll end up 40. The top, point top, because it goes 5, you can go 5 feet above that.
it's measured to the midpoint of the roof, so depending on how the roof is angled, it could go, you know, yeah, 3 to 5 feet above the midpoint, depending on the size. And the,
What, they did, I mean, it kind of seems like a blanket thing, not taking into consideration of a community like ours that's a little over 2,000 people living in it, and that if it opens it up to all zones, it feels like it will be a crowd, and, rather than keeping it in the multifamily. Yeah, you know, some of these things start out for communities of 20,000 or more, and so we're not affected by them, or don't have to deal with them. But now this one seems like it goes right to the, right to the ground all over. And, I think there's kind of a sadness in seeing what that could look like, and having, you know, somebody, so many people right next door to you, and I don't know. I guess this is being a small town community person like I am.
Sharon, yeah, I think it's important to remember that that condos are not allowed to look different than any other kind of development. So for example, I have an 1,100 square foot house and a 300 square foot ADU on my property, and a garage and a yard, and it very much looks like a single family home. And that, like, I could make the ADU, like, I could make it a condo with, under the new rules technically, so that someone else could own my ADU, you know, and I don't want to do that, but it doesn't, like, just because it's a condo, it won't necessarily look different, because we still have rules about the number of units and the amount of lot coverage and the height and size and all the other things that you can have in a single family zone. So none of that changes for a condo. It still has to follow all of those rules.
But it does, you know, there's more people, there's more noise, there's more vehicles. So it does impact, a neighborhood, especially in a single family, neighborhood. And I
Well-
can see that it's being pushed on everybody from the state, and I don't know. It seems like we don't have a lot of space for, you know, a bunch of condos. Where in the city, if you've got a, you know, like Seattle, if you live in a neighborhood, which I grew up in, there wasn't any land for, you know, condos and things to squeeze in, and they had plenty of property that they could be built on. I don't know, it just seems suffocating to me. And are they, is the purpose of this that they're supposed to be affordable? Or-
they're not regulating the price on these. They're just requiring them to be sellable as individual units.
But I mean, simply boil it down, it's you're adding multiple owners to the same lot size.
Yeah,
You divide that up, in theory, it should be, I don't wanna say affordable, but it should be less expensive than a single family home that go on the same lot.
well, if everybody in there was a twin. but everybody's different, they got different ideas, no, you're not gonna do that, you know, and so on, so I don't know, it just feels squeezed in.
Yeah, and
So as an example, right now, there are duplexes in the single family zones. And, you know, they're required to look a lot like a single family home in terms of the size and lot coverage and all that, but you can have a duplex in the single family zone currently, those exist. But they have to be owned by the same person. So it means that like somebody could live in one side and rent the other, but often like both units are rented. And the only change here is that with condos, it means that each side could have a separate owner. And duplexes are cheaper than a freestanding single family home by nature because they're sharing a lot and a wall. And so if someone could buy half of a duplex rather than rent it, then like that is a lower cost ownership option essentially, versus right now, the same building type is allowed, but it would only be able to be a rental. So there is a little bit of an affordability component just because a duplex or an ADU would generally cost less than a single family home all by itself.
And the
We're
person's
volunteering,
building.
you'd like to drive me around town and show you.
Sure.
When somebody's building equity rather than rent.
It's just an ownership model, it doesn't change density. It doesn't necessarily cause development to occur.
Doesn't
Differently.
even one more unit on a block create lesser
But
density?
that unit can be generated anyway, it would just be a rental instead of a separate owner. That's the only thing that changes.
yeah, I would assume the majority of this is gonna be existing properties that would opt to move into this model. We have a couple contractors, developers in the audience. Do any of you see a pathway of using this as a means or a goal to develop against? Put you on the spot. Yeah. No comment?
Yeah,
no,
that's not a good one.
So there are existing duplexes in town. Right? Are you aware?
I think I'll just have to start walking
Okay.
and seeing what I can see. It's so visual that it's, you know, like I said, at the planning commission, I'd like to see a great big table that somebody didn't have to do anything fancy, but just put the houses. And I know that a guy that I think he's passed away now, did that years ago. And I have the paper that he wrote about it. And you can see all the houses, and it was for growth I can't remember his name on it. I think his wife's name was Tina, that rings a bell for everybody. Was it Ryman? He lived up on my signal. It's hard for me, my brain doesn't picture things that way, so it's hard for me to follow all this and not really see what you're talking about.
I think the trick, Sharon, is that you can't see it. Like condos, it will look the same. Like nothing, whether or not condos are allowed in single family zones will not change what is built there and how it looks. Because you can already, like the amount of units you can have is already set, and this doesn't change the amount of units you can have. It's just whether those can be rented or owned. So there's no change in how anything looks or the number of units that are possible to build on a lot.
But it's the number of people
No.
on that spot changes.
No, so yes,
On that spot.
two rented houses,
Pardon me?
a duplex unit with 2 units.
Well, that's a duplex, but I'm.
Sure, but let's use it as the example of that's the key case for condominiumization. So that's the key case
Yeah,
where
it looks-
an owner might sell it, and then the person that buys it may make it a condo to sell the second unit.
Mhm.
And in that case, you are probably actually reducing the total number of cars because people now own it. Or rentals tend to be too expensive now in our community to have a single tenant. So rentals tend to have multiple tenants in them. increasing the number of vehicles and people. And that's the rental, that's our rental, one of our rental problems. But in this case, if ownership occurs, we actually, maybe we either find an affordability curve where people are now building equity. That could be a potential outcome, or we actually reduce the total number of residents inside city limits because people will no longer be able to pack density into rentals. So there's a lot of questions in this for me that are kind of outside the code, that are like, what is the community impact of condominiumization? And nobody has a great study that I can find. There's a lot of industry studies and they're iffy in the data they prove, but in this case, it's just the ownership that changes. That's really all we're talking about. I don't think we'll get more people or more things or more cars. We'll probably end up with fewer if we have more condo units. Because it'll be single families owning it with 1 or 2 cars instead of 2 or 3 renters with 2 to 3 cars.
Yeah, it's important to disassociate what we think of as a condo building, like an apartment building, from condominiumization, where it's existing properties we have today. It's just changing the ownership structure.
So you build as many units as you could in, you could have a building that big and you could make it, or just, or you could, make it even, in the same building, you could add a lot more.
You wouldn't be able to. No, our code stipulates that you can only build a certain number of units per square footage on a size of a zone property.
Okay, so what fits within the boundaries of that, and no more than 30 feet. 35 units.
So follows the existing
So far,
code we have. in
until
place.
the state says, oh, you can go 50. Okay.
I don't think that's gonna happen. They don't regulate that
We
anymore.
think any of it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for letting me take the time.
Yeah, that's a valid thing. Thanks for sharing. Any other comments around condominiums? So I think we'll pick this up on the Zoom call.
Yeah, the Zoom meeting, I'll just go over the same information. We'll see what other questions might be out there. And then I'll do my best. The staff report is due 10 days prior, so let me check the calendar real quick. May, June. So I'll have a couple of days there to incorporate any additional questions or ideas that come out of that 22nd meeting into the staff report, and then we'll get the staff report off to you guys and the community for the June 5th hearing.
Would we be able to schedule at that point, public hearing around code adoption for condominiums in general, outside of the specific code request? Or is that pulled up together?
It'll be the same. I'll take the request, and then I'm going to add a few other changes in there that we think are necessary, like the district use chart. And that'll be the full package. Here's what was requested. Here's what we're recommending. And then Planning Commission, you'll hold your hearing on it, and we'll see how the city council wants to process that forward.
Great, okay, that's clear.
Will that be publicized in the Wenatchee World and the Echo, and not in the things that nobody looks at, when somebody dies, they're
Classified.
yeah. Someplace.
Well, yeah, we're required to, and we only typically notice things in the legal ads. I kind of have a little heartburn about changing the process when there's an individual application in play, because I don't want to treat that applicant different than we would our own code amendment. If we want to change our code amendment process as a whole and require display ads in the regular newspaper, we can do that. But I would have a little bit of concern about treating this applicant different than anyone else or the city normal process. That's not to say we won't do it, Sharon. It's just to say I have some concerns.
Yeah, I can understand. I can understand that. I just, nobody's gonna find it there really. It has to be somewhere where people are gonna find it, and they're not gonna drive, nobody drives down here to see, the things you have printed on the bulletin board down here.
Well, we'll put it in the legal section of the paper like we normally would. And we may end up with a regular display ad too, but
Okay. Lilith, are we prepared to start some discussion around inclusionary zoning unilot subdivision tonight?
not entirely, no. I did get some direction at the council retreat, but it was more broad. I think they ran into the same challenges you as a planning commission body also ran into. But I do have some direction. What I have prepared today is to walk through unit lot subdivision because we did find an example. The city of Snohomish has a unit lot subdivision code. So we can roughly walk through that one. So this is their code, and I've just essentially copied and pasted it into a Word document. And they reference, other sections of their code, which I have not reviewed yet. But overall, we have a purpose statement, which is pretty standard. And Maggie, can you scroll down? The applicability of what sites this pertains to. Oh, Maggie, don't go so far yet. Hold on one second, right there. So sites decaying, for them, they did detached accessory dwelling units. Here they're saying may not be subdivided into individual lots. This came up at the conference and City of Snohomish just last week, and City of Snohomish was talking about their existing code. With the changes in state law, they're going to be the same as everybody else. With condominiums will be permitted. So unless they make a change to this unit lot, condominiums will take place instead of unit lots. So it'll be interesting for them to think about those differences and what they want to allow or not allow. Like maybe now that condos are going to be permitted, maybe they want to come back and revisit this particular item and allow the ADUs to be addressed as a unit lot subdivision. And for those in the audience who might not know what this terminology means, it just means that the unit and a portion of the land would go together, as opposed to a condominium where they just have the unit itself, and maybe sometimes they have an assigned parking space, but everything else is considered common area and managed under common ownership. With unit lot subdivisions, you can think of them as super small lots, dividing up existing lots into smaller lots. Any case, they're talking here next about zoning districts, so we'll just go past that.
So we're going back up first applicability, so that number, the detached dwelling unit. So that's, in my opinion, would be the only use case, so we wouldn't want to restrict it to that, right?
That's right. We would want to allow it. And that's what I was saying. I think they'll want to revisit this and allow it too, but they've had theirs on the book for a little longer than us, or longer than most, I meant to say. Go ahead and keep scrolling down. Only sites developed or proposed to be developed with the following sites may be subdivided into individual lots per that section. So.
Are we gonna look at 4?
Yes, for previously developed lots, eligibility for a unit shall be subject to compliance with all the standards of the parent lot. And that's kind of what we were talking about with our condo codes too. They have to be legally established on the primary lot, and we're not increasing density. Go ahead. And then they have an allowance for deviation from dimensional standards. This is a concern because you no longer have those setbacks and lot sizes. And so we'd have something similar to this, just acknowledging that the creation of these lots will create a deviation from the adopted standards.
I didn't see them trying to fit, I guess they do state that it has to conform to kind of their common code for the parent lot. So I think that relationship between the parent and the unit is the important association in the deviation context. So if you meet the parent lot, then inside the lot, in the unit lots themselves, those are non-governed, it sounds like. Yes.
I think I was reading that the same way.
Okay.
Then subdivision of cottage housing, which is, I think, what we would hope this would mostly be used for, but any case, and detached dwelling developments. And I don't know how Snohomish defines that separate from the accessory dwelling unit, which they obviously were treating differently. So here it just talks about all the provisions required for cottage and multi-dwelling units. And I'm not sure to what extent we'd like to continue with something similar. Like you're saying, the parent parcel needs to meet all the setbacks. For these unit lot subdivisions, is a individual lot size something the planning commission wants to regulate?
I would think not, because I am trying to think of a scenario where it would not either be a single family residence and an ADU, or cottage housing, or multifamily. It's like the development has to conform to some other code, essentially. So adding this like detached dwelling developments, it's like, well, that would have to fall within cottage housing in our code. It's like, it just seems sort of extraneous to have a separate requirement.
There must be some other reference, because item 2, D2 is very specific about the minimum lot size of detached dwelling developments, but I get, yeah, it's a little bit of, that's a confusing section.
Do they have a definition in their code for detached dwelling developments? Like, is that a separate, building type that is defined similar that like cottage housing would be defined?
Yes,
Take them.
Yeah.
Like, if we don't have that, then we don't need to include it. It's like we've defined all the types of development you can do, so we don't have.
Yeah, I think it's probably easier for us to avoid that section.
Like, that was worth asking. Historically, we have looked at minimum lot size for lots, like multifamily requires that 2,000 square feet per unit. So it wouldn't be unheard of if we did that, but it does create a limitation that wouldn't otherwise exist and may hinder unit lot creation. Or in with the allowance of condos instead of a unit lot, it'll just drive people towards maybe condominiumizing. So,
It's actually,
oh, go ahead.
oh, much, yeah, definitely a weird. Well, I don't even know why they have it.
Okay, so design standards are the same as any other development. Unit lots shall comply with all other provisions except for the lot lines. Again, we're just trying to acknowledge that there's a deviation from the underlying standards. And for Snohomish, they included mobile home parks here. We don't have any mobile home parks in town, and our mobile home park regulations are overly onerous and outdated. So that's a separate discussion. And then quite simply, it gets into the approval process, which for us would be a type of subdivision. So that's fairly straightforward. Let's peek at the criteria. So the criteria for separate sewer, water, and power meter.
So I know we'll talk about the UGA stuff later on, but maybe we get ahead of that so that we don't create the same scenario. We'll just be specific that it's sewer and septic.
I'd like to be clear. We have not created a scenario. The county has interpreted our code separate from our recommendation of how they interpret our code, creating a problem in the county. They asked us how we would interpret that code, and I told them that for the county, it would be well, water, and septic, and they would not accept that interpretation. And that was last year, last May. So, I want to be clear that this is not something the city has created by erroneously drafting code. That's not the case.
I don't think that the city erroneously drafted code. I don't deny that the county is choosing to essentially create a moratorium where they didn't need to, but I think that changing that line in the code might be the only solution under current county administration.
Yeah.
So I agree that being cautious about how it's worded in this code so that they are not able to create a similar conflict would be wise.
So parking would be established the same as it currently is. Number two, though, that gets back to what we talked about in cottage housing. If they're doing a unit lot subdivision, is there a minimum open space that you would want to require? If you've had an opportunity to think about that. And here again, they went with a square footage, but they also did a minimum dimensional size. And we could copy and paste our cottage housing standard if you felt that unit lot subdivision should have both open space, unused, unassigned, as well as assigned open space, like for parking.
Yeah, I would be in favor of keeping it consistent for similar uses.
I think it may come down to the applicability standards too, we consider, Lilith. So if we say that we wouldn't allow applicability in some cases, the approval criteria would change dramatically.
Well, between now and our next meeting, think about those cases in which you wouldn't want it to apply. So I assume those are pretty narrow and there might be reason why you're thinking that, and we can talk that through. As opposed to talking about where we want it to see, which I'm assuming is a broader area. So in any case, if you could spend some time thinking about that, we could talk about it next month, that would be great. They have a provision in here for private streets. For the most part, the city does not allow private streets. But with these unit lot subdivisions, what happens to that driveway? And if it is serving more units, how is it classified and maintained? So that's similar here. They have joint uses of parking facilities as if there's a shared parking area. And then tandem parking, which we currently do allow for the same unit. Right. I've only ever seen us have 2 cars stacked, but it would be interesting if we needed to stack 3 cars. That would be interesting. And then number 4 is just joint use maintenance and covenants. And then the subdivision was 0 lot line development. They're just allowing for some sort of access area to maintain adjacent buildings and lots. We want 10 feet in between buildings, so I'd have to think about how they have it worded to make sure that that could still be achieved, but that's the same idea, I think, to help reduce fire wall construction standards kicking in at the building level. And they have an interesting provision here about remodel and maintenance being in compliance with the approval. Oh, I'd probably want to reach out to them and ask them if they've ever had to use that provision. Like, how have they conditioned some things, whereas a remodel or maintenance needed to be re-examined? Maybe an expansion of the building. I'm not entirely sure. So might give them a call and ask them about that provision there.
Well, if I'm trying to understand how this would apply to a pre-existing structure.
Mm-hmm.
And the way this is written, if I read the final plating note, is that it's a plan, it's a subdivision, so it's in their code, it has to be a pre-platted design that is built at a single point in time, or the lots cannot be sold. So reading this, unit lots are not buildable lots independent of the overall development. How would we apply development standards to pre-existing structures?
The way we have been talking about unit lot subdivision is existing built structures. And so if you had a house and a detached accessory dwelling unit, you could divide that lot in two lots, and each individual lot would have their home and ideally their parking, but unless we allowed for, common area parking, that was one of their questions here. So yeah, it just becomes a 2-lot subdivision. With the 2 accessory dwelling units, it could be a 3-lot subdivision. Does that answer your question? Sort
of. I'm just thinking of their clause in the platting and how we would essentially you'd be replatting a plot of land, right, to become a subdivision. And so during replatting, I'm wondering how they apply the independence clause in here, independent of the overall development. just a kind of a, it seems to be like geared towards a modern, towards new build.
It is.
Yeah, with net new building, and so applying it to an existing ADU and an existing structure seems like it would be difficult to apply the replat. The replat would work.
The
Yeah.
unit lots are not buildable lots independent of the overall development. I think here you could also read that to say overall site. So the parent parcel. So in other words, you still need, as a parent parcel, you still need to meet all your setbacks and your density. The unit lots in the replat, as you're calling it, or the further subdivision of a lot, a parcel of land into smaller lots or parcels.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Yeah,
Allison,
yeah, go ahead, Allison.
I would also take that to mean that you can't take a parcel of bare land and
Into unit lots.
subdivide it as unit lots without
The units.
without the units on it. So you can do this for new development when there is a plan to build all of those units. You know, when like essentially the building permits for all the units are being issued along with the approval of the unit lot subdivision. Or you can apply this to existing structures, but you can't just say, I have this parcel of bare land and I'm going to subdivide it and sell off these units individually without developing them, and just let independent owners develop them willy-nilly without like a cohesive plan for all of the structures on those parcels.
Okay. I think, yeah, that's a good clarification. That's a funny sentence to me. So. Thank you.
So that's all I had for today. Like I said, I'd like to come back in June. We'll have the hearing, we'll have a unit lot subdivision. And to the extent that I can, I'll pull together something on the inclusionary zoning.
Lil, can we add the topic of 1836-25 to our docket?
No,
Why not?
we're gonna address it before that.
Okay. If it continues to be fight, can we bring it up? Because it seems like it would, I mean, totally appreciate the effort you've had in having to battle this for the last year, but if there is a roadblock, could we not just change the language and readapt the code?
I will discuss this offline.
Fair enough.
So what is sorry, you were rattling off some numbers there, what was the?
So currently, the way that the code reads, it says for ADUs to be built in the UGA, anything over 900 square feet has to be attached to city sewer.
Oh,
As you know, city sewer doesn't span here.
It doesn't just say over 900, it says that any ADU, it just says ADUs must be connected to city water and sewer. So, and that line in the code exists because it also is specifying that ADUs over 900 square feet require separate services from the primary dwelling unit. Yeah, carry on, Drew.
Yeah, so obviously our interpretation is that would mean septic, but the county is not true. It's caused basically a moratorium for any ADUs to get built in the UGA, right? Which is, I mean, I've had 2 or 3 people come up to me and bring it up, and I think Allison, you've had obviously some issues from an architecture standpoint.
Yeah, I have more than one client that would like to be building an ADU and cannot apply for a permit right now because it's in the UGA.
Yeah, we can cite our Lilith, but
Mm.
hopefully sooner than later. If not, I think we have an. But there's a question in the audience, Rick?
I have a fair amount to run through real quick, but, it starts off with, Lilith, you mentioned that, the state law that's changed, that's pushing all this, is the max is to add 2 ADUs to a site. I read it as, it is a triplex, duplex, triplex zoning and single family, not limiting it to ADU. Cause if you're an ADU, then you fall under certain other requirements. So every single family lot can have 2 or 3 units, not ADUs. Are you interpreting that, or did I get it wrong?
I would not interpret it as triplex. It says 2 ADUs per lot.
Okay, I'll double check on what I read then. So that totally puts it in a different thing. Number 2, Algona has a unit lot subdivision ordinance. I can send you the link. I've read it. It's more current than this one. So it's a small town in, you know, over by Tacoma, Algona. It's really small. And they have something that might be better than this. It's just, if you want me to, I can email it to you.
That sounds good. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll shoot it to you tomorrow. And then, so open space on that subject, guys, that, as you address it as a planning commission. So at a high level, unit lots were created to create, instead of ADUs, separate like houses. But we can call them ADUs, but if we're gonna sell them off, they become your own little house. I would keep that in mind, because what's driving this is we're trying to create housing for people. And if you limit the size, that's okay. You limit the housing choice and people and all that. And I know that we may not want to change, but that's just the purpose of the unit lot, was so we can all own our land and have our yards. And then all the other requirements, parking, all that, you guys would work through to see what looks nice. So, in terms of the driveway, I've done a lot of townhomes with unit lot subdivisions, and it's just, CCNRs. They're recorded and they just tell everybody, you know, join easement, something goes wrong, everybody just chips in and pays for it. It's not a city road or anything. It's just a driveway that comes in that services whatever happens to get built. The other one was, on the open space, yeah. So what we found is that they required so much on the ground, and that became an ugly site. And finally, they realized that depending on the size of the project, you can have a smaller yard, and they allowed like a deck. And they said, it's gotta be so much deck, so much, you can have it all on the ground, or you can have part of it count as deck and part of it as yard. And that really helped design and flow of everything, and the use of the land. So it's just something to consider, splitting up open space if you do requirement. A minimum, I think a minimum, requirement in a unit lot subdivision is possibly something to consider. And here's why. Because if you allow somebody to unit lot something, you might get developers in here unit lotting a 200 square foot spot and put a little shack on it, you know, because the whole parcel meets the parent regulations. And so I think that's why you might want to have some sort of minimum size land-wise. You think that through, but I certainly wouldn't leave it as a blank check and let developers, like, next thing you know, you got this legally platted 200 square foot bunch of little things, but your density drives that. In the zone, your density can do it based on the number of units that you allow, like a duplex or triplex. The subdivide and sell thing, A lot of times it's the process of some people will subdivide and sell the lot, but it's not gonna change what gets built there. So I don't know that if it's good or bad to restrict that, because the same thing's gonna get built, the same standards apply. You can't make anything bigger or smaller just because they sold the lot. So I don't know that you want to restrict that, but maybe you do. I don't know. It's just something to consider, but maybe what they're doing in the right assessment, what Allison's was that, they require a building permit with the unit lot finalization. When we approve the unit lot, you have to have a building permit in place. I don't, maybe that's not bad, but the fact to require it, I don't know. Yeah, and then I'm all over what Drew's saying about the connection to the septic. I live in the UGA, and I just think it's weird. So.
Have you spoken to your county commissioner?
Yeah. No, not yet. But my understanding, when I talked to the county, they didn't give me any grief on it. They gave me the interpretation of this. So it's something that's kicked in the last year and a half, because when I spoke to them a year and a half, they said, anything, as long as my ADU was under 900 square feet, I can go septic. And I said, okay. And I never heard that you couldn't build it. They didn't say that at all. They said I could build one. It has to be under 900 feet if all you have is septic.
I'm interested in your reading of the Algona code, because looking at it here, it's very narrow applicability. So duplexes, townhouses, and courtyard apartments all.
Duplexes, which is a unit lot subdivision, because you'd have to be on the ground, right?
Right, but they define a duplex as a very unique structure, right? So duplex is a defined structure type. So it's an interesting, just like, they've narrowed it intentionally too. So they're only allowing it for a subset of land use types.
Right.
So
That's good. I just knew I was given that by the state. And then, but to me, ideally, what would really be nice, and this controls the look and feel of the neighborhoods. My biggest suggestion to you guys is to allow small little like ADUs to be separately, so they're still homes. You don't have to have a duplex or a triplex and then divide the wall. And that, to the unit on, what is it, Harrison, or what, the road? Stafford, yeah. The way to regulate that is to say every structure has a max width, then it has to be separated by 10 feet. So you just set it in your code, any structure in this zone cannot exceed this width. And then that will create the single family. And then the final thing is how you enter it. I've seen beautiful homes that read single family, but it's a ADU on this side. It's just the entrance is around the side. And so prescriptive guidance instead of, not prescriptive, but you could say that this is our desire. We want it to look like a single family home in the single family zones. Density, we encourage, number of units for, that. And we'll give you flexibility, but parking has to be met like this, sewer connection met like this, met like that. And, and limit the size. But and then the building width cannot exceed, and you can just pick a number, 30 feet, 35. Allison can help you decide the right width to keep a single family zone to stay looking like a single. So that will allow you to unit lots without getting big wide buildings. And that's my suggestion how to do it on the single family zone. So thank you.
So I was thinking of unit lot subdivision as something that could be used alongside any of the building types that we currently allow. For example, we allow single family residences with ADUs, we allow duplexes, we have a multifamily zone where there are requirements surrounding multifamily development, with more units. And we now have cottage housing. I guess my understanding was that unit lot subdivision would apply to any of those types that we allow, and it wouldn't create a new building arrangement. or new density. Is that incorrect? This could be used independently? Because then, we would need another set of regulations, but if it's just like, I mean, in terms of density, basically, if it has to follow one of the existing codes that we have, like cottage housing or ADUs, et cetera, then that's why I was thinking you don't have to have an additional requirement about the lot size or the structure size because it's already regulated.
Well, the property on Stafford clearly shows that you can build a wide building on a single family zone. So, yeah, you don't have to change the rules, but you might get those. It won't happen often. And, I think I would rather see 4 houses on that same lot and develop the code so that you could have 4 independent houses or 4 house with an ADU with a side entry now, and that would increase density. That would increase density, but that's the whole purpose of what the whole state is trying to drive is density within a city that has services, because that we need more housing. And if we keep the rules the same, then we're gonna have the same high cost situation. You're not breaking the density in the city curve. But my suggestion to the city is let's do that, increase the density where we're supposed to, because we need to get more housing types, but let's still keep the look of a single family zone. And by doing, yes, maybe it is some code changes, but it wouldn't be much. It's just one building width. Structure width, not depth, structure width. Max structure width, that's it.
I think there are single family homes in this town that are as wide as the development on Stafford.
Yeah, and that's.
I mean, it's like kind of hard. It's like that. It's on lots that are allowed by the city. Like, I mean,
Yep, sorry.
I don't want to like regulate all the options out because there's like because once or twice it gets used in a way that some people find unattractive, I guess, even though maybe that's an unfortunate instance.
Rick's arguing for residential design review board.
No, no, not at all. No, I think it can be handled easier now. But yeah, I get your point, and I don't think there'll be lots of them, but it just can be done. And the other way to do it is modulation. You just make sure that they have to jog back 10 feet every 30 feet in width. It has to jog back 10 feet and come forward again. That modulation creates a developer nightmare that then makes it less cost effective, but also they'll get keeping 4 individual units by being more friendly with allowing units behind units. You'll get more value from a developer standpoint, and the city gets more, like, it's residential housing, but you also encourage ADUs. There's actually townhomes with ADUs in them now in Seattle, they have townhome, bottom floor is the ADU. And it helps them buy the property and rent because they get that rental income. And that's something to consider. That's my input, that, yeah. I'm not for more density, but that's kind of what we have to do or to get housing prices down. I'm against it too. Not a building.
Any last comments from planning commission?
So the meeting next week or later, but I can't make, is that a problem?
No, we don't need to officially have quorum without, right? That's quorum courtesy.
No, no quorum required.
Anything from our friends at Benj this week? Let's put it on the spot, no? Sorry. Going once, going twice, any further comments from the crowd? Right, then we will accept a motion to adjourn.
So
Motion to adjourn. Oh, yeah, so-